Karen and I are thrilled to be with you again today. We really enjoy coming out, sharing with you. We have my mother with us today, and so if you wondered who the good-looking lady is on the front row with us, that is my mother. That's where I get my good looks. So I hope that you'll meet her before it's over with. In Matthew chapter 25, beginning with verse 17, Jesus tells a story. Jesus was the master at telling stories. Nobody could do it better. If you have a New Testament with you this morning, you may want to turn to Matthew 25, because as we start there at verse 14, we're going to go right through the text for the first half of the sermon at least. And in this parable that Jesus is telling, the context here, if you want to put the text in context, the context is that Jesus has been stressing the need for God's people to be ready, to be prepared for his second coming. In class this morning, if you were in the auditorium class, Brody talked about that as Paul writes the first letter and the second letter to the church at Thessalonica. They had a lot of questions about the second coming. Jesus in his ministry talks a lot about it. And in Matthew chapter 25, he says, you got to be ready. You got to be ready. It's not a question if it's going to happen. The only question is when. And in this story we're going to look at this morning, he reaches out and he grabs everybody's attention. He gets everybody's attention because he's going to talk about money. Money. We all like to talk about, hear about, think about money. And it begins in verse 14 by saying, again. Again what? What do you mean again? Well, again, to put the text in context, go back and look at verse 13. Verse 13, Jesus is finishing up the story he talks, the parable that we know as the parable of the 10 virgins. And as he concludes it in verse 13, he said, therefore keep watch, because you don't know the day or the hour when I will return. So he says in verse 14, again. So we're carrying that same thought, that same thread into the second story. And he says again, it'll be like a man going on a journey. He called his servants and entrusted property to them. To one he gave 5 talents of money. Now what is a talent of money? Well, it depends on who you listen to. It depends on which scholar, which commentator that you want to read. But the first thing that I would point out is that in my opinion, a talent, whatever the value is, it's not the value that's described, but its weight. Its weight. Now you say, why would you think that? Revelation chapter 16, verse 21. If you want to flip back to the last book of the Bible. In Revelation chapter 16, if you have the King James Version. In the King James Version, it says, there fell upon men a great hailstorm out of heaven. Did y'all have any hail Friday night? We had a lot over in the Metroplex. And John's writing and says, there fell out of heaven a great hail, every stone about the weight of a talent. So a talent, when Jesus talks about talents in this parable, he's probably, and I say probably because I don't know this absolute, but I think he's probably talking about the weight of money. And the value would vary depending on what it was, whether it was gold, silver, copper, or whatever. If it was silver, most scholars believe that a talent would be the equivalent of 20 years' wages for a day laborer. It's a lot of money. 20 years' wages. So he gave one man 5 talents of money. To another he gave 2 talents. To another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Now, did you catch that? Each according to his ability. Jesus recognizes in this parable something that I'm going to say that sounds anti-American. But what Jesus is saying, not all people are created equal when it comes to ability. The Bible never says when we look at our abilities, we're created equal. In fact, Jesus validates here that it's not that way. It's not to put anybody down, but it's not to elevate anybody either. It's just a fact. He says some had the ability to handle 5 talents, some had 2, some had 1. And he gave to each according to their ability. He continues the story. Verse 16. He says the man who had received the 5 talents went at once, put his money to work, and gained 5 more. So also the one with the 2 talents gained 2 more. These 2 men didn't let any grass grow under their feet. They went at once. They'd been given a blessing, and they immediately began using it. And we'd like to all know what they did. Scripture doesn't reveal it to us, but they invested it and doubled their money. Both of them did. Pretty good deal. Wouldn't you like to know that for your portfolio? But again, they doubled it. But the third man, Jesus says of him, but the man who received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Notice it's not his money. It's his master's money. He has use of it, but it's not his. Then verse 19, the scene changes. Master comes home. Comes back. Verse 19 says, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. Folks, when Jesus comes again, there will be a settling of the accounts. There'll be a balancing of the books. And here's what happened. He said the man who had received the 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I have gained 5 more. Notice again, he says, you entrusted me with 5 talents. They weren't his. They were his to use. They belonged to the master. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. I think it's very interesting here that the master said, you've been good, you've been faithful with a few things. A few? Now, if the figures were anywhere close to accurate that we used a moment ago, if it were silver, and if a talent equaled 20 years' wages for a common man, 5 talents would be 100 years' salary. 20 talents would be 200 years' salary. Now, there may be 1 or 2 of you that's got 200 years' salary buried in your backyard, but I'd say that's rare. Would you agree that'd be out of the norm? 200 years. He says a few things. To the master, it was a few. The man with the 2 talents also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 talents. I've gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Friends, it's exactly the same thing he said to the 5-talent man. Exactly, word for word, which shows us again God's expectations of people is based on their ability, not on their abundance. Can I say that again? God's expectations, the master's expectations, were on the people's ability, not the abundance. The 2-talent fellow that had 4 now got the same approval and the same reward as a man who had 5 and now has 10. But then we got the other fellow. The man who had received the 1 talent came and said, Master, I knew that you are a hard man. Uh-oh. That's our first clue right there. Anytime anybody starts out answering a question with an excuse, it's never a pretty picture. Particularly if in the excuse it blames the master for the result. And that's what he does. He starts off by blaming him. He said in verse 24, I knew you are a hard man, which I'm guessing was a lie. He didn't seem too hard to me. He seemed pretty gracious and giving and compassionate to me. How about you? That he would give money, talents, weights of money to his servants when he left. I'd say he was a pretty gracious, compassionate, free-giving sort of fella. Here's what he said. Third man said, I knew you're a hard man, harvesting where you've not sown, gathering where you've not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your talent in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. I'm going to give it back to you. Didn't lose a nickel. Here it is. Well, you see, he's given a second excuse. First excuse was, you're a hard, mean, rigid, cantankerous man. Second excuse is, I was afraid. Fear. And since I was afraid, I took no risk. I exerted no effort, but I did keep your money safe. Here it is. I can give it back to you. Not my money, your money. Well, the flavor of this whole story, the flavor of the whole occasion changes. The master tells the third servant, you wicked, lazy servant. He didn't even Dale Carnegie this thing with him. He didn't even soften it up. He didn't break the news easy. He hit him right between the eyes, and he said, you are lazy and you are wicked. Why? Why? Well, he goes on talking. He says, so you knew that I harvest where I've not sown, I gather where I've not scattered seed. Notice the master uses the same words, the same phrase that the third servant had used. But it's a question. It's a question mark there. It's not an exclamation point. It's a question. I believe he was responding to the insult that the one talent man had brought against him. Using his own words. That was the charge the servant had made. I still think it's an invalid, slanderous accusation. But the master picks up on it and says, okay, let's run with that. If that was your assessment of me, if that's what you felt about me, then you should have taken it, put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. That's verse 27. Can you see the indictment of the master made no sense? If he really believed that the man was that hard and he wouldn't be happy just getting the seed money back, he'd at least put it in the bank. He would at least draw interest. Well, again, the mood really changes. Verse 28, the master says, take the talent from him. Seize it from him. The other guy's got more talents. Take his from him. Give it to the one who has the 10 talents now. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And then he says, and throw that worthless servant outside. Throw him out into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So far in this parable, in this story, Jesus has called the third servant wicked, lazy, and now worthless. Why? What had he done? Folks, that's the problem. He hadn't done anything. He didn't do anything. He didn't even try. That was his sin. He did not exert any effort. And because of that, Jesus, the Master, referred to him as wicked, lazy, and worthless. Now that's the story of the parable of the talents. You've heard it many times. I've read right through it. We've grabbed the obvious points that are being made. But can I suggest to you this morning that I believe there are more layers to this story than what we sometimes look at. It's kind of like an onion. You know, you can peel off a layer and there's another layer, and you peel off that layer and there's other layers. I think in looking at this parable, we always talk about money and investments and stewardship, and that's definitely what Jesus is talking about. That's good, that's accurate, but I think there's more to it than that. And if you would, I'd like to peel back the onion for a few minutes here before we quit and look at it from a little bit different angle. And I think we need to understand that perhaps the real story about this parable is just as it said, it's about our abilities, our gifts, as they're referred to in other passages, our abilities, our gifts, our skill sets that have been given to us by God. And I think the first thing I would point out is that we need to recognize what those are. We need to define those. And as I get older, the more years I spend in the church and working with churches, I don't think we do a good job of that sometimes. I don't think we spend any time with that sometimes to really define what my individual gifts are, what your gifts are, and then to accept that once we've defined it and put them to use. We don't all have the same gifts. We don't all have the same talents. And I'm not talking, when I use the word talent, I'm not talking about a weight of money now. I've shifted gears. I'm going to use our language, our vocabulary. I'm talking about skill sets. I'm talking about gifts, talents, as we would call them, of what we are good at. We don't all have the same talents. And then when we get them, we don't all have the same talents in the same measure, do we? Well, otherwise, why did Jesus say each one was given to them according to their ability? We all have different abilities. Again, it's not to elevate anybody. It's not to put anybody down. It's just what it is. There were in this story, there were 5 talent people, 2 talent people, and 1 talent people. May I point out to you there were no 0 talent people? No 0 talent people. I learned this in my first few years of preaching when I was at the Northside Church in Dallas. And I was a much younger preacher at that time. And we started a visitation program. We're going to go out and visit those who visited our services. And we got this program kicked off. And the first thing that happened, and I say this, I don't mean anything rude, or I'm just talking the facts. Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts here. The first folks that volunteered really didn't need to volunteer for this. They weren't any good at it. Not everybody knows how to visit. Not everybody knows how to do hospital visitation. Have you ever been in the hospital? Everybody that comes by, are they good at it? Job's friends weren't. Remember Job? When the 3 friends came? Finally, Job looked at them and said, "Miserable comforters are you all. What a lousy bunch of friends have I got." They were no good at it. I remember being in the hospital several years ago for a major neck surgery. And a fella came by to visit me. Came in. He said, "You know, I had a friend. I had a friend had this same surgery, same doctor. Noticed the doctor, same hospital." I said, "Is that right?" He said, "Yeah." He said he died. I said, well, thank you for coming by. I appreciate the visit. Glad you could come. Not everybody's got that talent. Okay? Back to my story at Northside. These folks went out and they went together, 9 of them, to visit somebody's house. They would check out a church van and they'd go together. Can you imagine 9 people coming in your house? And when they'd come in, they were like Job's friends. They just sat there. They didn't talk. They'd just sit there until everybody was uncomfortable, and then they'd get up and leave after a while. Well, we got complaints about this. So the elders told me, I was a young preacher, about 25, 6 years old. So the elders said, fix this. Elders are good about doing that, especially Spencer's got a lot to look forward to. Fix this. So I said, okay. So I was trying to figure out how to fix it. I was sitting at my desk, and I was going through the church directory, and I realized there were a few names. One in particular, I'd been there 3 or 4 years, and there's one fellow's name in the church directory family. I'd never met him, never been there. So I thought, I don't see how they can mess this up. So we'll just send them over to see this fella and his family. Well, we did. I didn't know it, but by mistake. We didn't plan it by mistake. We sent them back to the same house the second week. So 2 Tuesday nights in a row, church van pulls up, 9 people come out, come into the man's house and just sit there. After the second week, I got a phone call. And the phone call, he said, preacher, I give up. I give up. He said, call the dogs off. I will be there Sunday. If you promise not to send them back, I will be there Sunday. I learned that day there are no zero talent people. They had a talent. We just didn't know what it was. The Apostle Paul, when writing to the church at Rome, he said, we have different gifts according to the grace given us. Romans 12:6. Peter would add, he said, each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. And then Paul gives a very graphic illustration in 1 Corinthians 12, how we should all use our particular gift, our particular talent, our ability for the kingdom, for the church. Paul says the body is not made up of one part, but many. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, would that make it cease to be part of the body? If the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, would it mean that it wasn't part of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But Paul says God has arranged the parts in the body, every one of them. Catch that? Every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. The eye can't say to the hand, I don't need you. The head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. The parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. Now, when I read that, I think of a computer keyboard. Now, if you're a hunt and peck kind of person, you can check out, and I'll come get you in a minute. This won't mean anything to you. But if you're a typist, you'll understand this illustration. The keyboard on a computer or a typewriter is laid out to where the keys that are the most often used, this finger, this finger, this finger, and this finger, they do the hitting of those keys. The keys that are not nearly as often used, the little guy gets that. And then you got the old thumbs. Say they're not good for anything. Oh, they hit that space bar. You see? Your hand is a good example of a church, really. All the fingers, 4 of them are pretty much conformist. You see that? They're different sizes, but they're pretty much conformist. Then you get an old thumb. He just doesn't seem like he fits That was the group that went out visiting that I told you about. They were thumbs. But they're needed. Now, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't want to preach for a whole congregation of thumbs. Okay? But you need some thumbs that are in there. But Paul says as long as you do this and the little finger doesn't try to get over here where the index finger is and say, let me come over there and work a while. Say, no, 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 no. You handle your part of the keep. As long as everybody does what they're good at, this thing works well. And it works real well, and you get a great product. That, folks, is the church. It's church. Now, let me ask you a question. How are we doing with that? How do we do with that? As members, are we recognizing? Are we defining our gifts? And then are we using them in a defined way? Through the years, it seems to me we don't do that. Not as well as we should. My very first job, before going to Dallas, my very first job out of school was in a university town, 2 colleges in that town. We had a lot of college professors attended church there. We had a lot of administrators and public school teachers, professional teachers from the public schools in the congregation. The hardest place I probably ever preached to get anybody to teach a Bible class. You know why it was? You may have been told this if you've tried to get Bible school teachers. I'm in the classroom 5 days a week. Don't put me in the classroom on Sunday. I don't want to do that on Sunday. Oh, you're going to use your talent for 5 days, but on Sunday you don't want to use it for the Lord? In that same church, true story, we had a mechanic, owned a mechanic shop in town, very successful. He was keeping the books at church. And we had a CPA in charge of the buses. Now, I was right out of school, but I thought something about this doesn't seem right. The mechanic didn't know a debit from a credit. He didn't need to. He knew how to fix cars. The CPA didn't know where the plug was on the oil pan, but he was out there every Saturday trying to work on the vans. Why? Because he'd always wanted to work on one. He's not going to work on his own car. He might mess that up. So let me come down to the church and work on the church's car. You have a work day at church. Painters don't want to paint. Plumbers don't want to do the plumbing. Why? Let me do something I'm not good at. Now, how smart is that? In the church, for the kingdom of God, let me do what I don't know how to do. And I'm going to bury my gift. I'm going to bury my talent. Folks, I know we don't mean to, but we do that. We do that. We bury the gift God's entrusted to us. It didn't work too well for the third servant. And best I can tell, it's not going to work too well for us either. Remember, in the parable, the message was if you don't use it, you lose it. You don't use it, you lose it. And very quickly, let me say on this, if you think your talent is being negative and critical, cantankerous, that's not a talent. That's a curse. That's a curse. There are those that think that is their talent. Paul said, though, in this talking about these different gifts in 1 Corinthians 12, he said there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. Some feel like that's their talent, and they just like to tear things up. I asked a man one time, why do you do this? Why do you behave like this? You know what his answer was? I've heard it many times through the years. He said, I just like to play the devil's advocate. We'll shoot high in life. Isn't that a wonderful ambition? I want to be an advocate. I want to help empower, push the agenda of the devil. Folks, we're not called upon to be the devil's advocate. We're called upon to be servants of God, servants of Christ, and to use our various talents any way that we can. The wickedness in this story wasn't because somebody lost any money. It's because he didn't try. I can't prove this, but have you ever wondered what would have happened if one of these three men had lost some of the money? All or part of it? My guess is if they'd done their best, if they were seizing the opportunities and they were trying, my guess is he'd still told them, well done, thy good and faithful servant, because they were trying. But if you're not doing something, bearing some kind of fruit, serving God in the church, you're just not using the gift God's given you. And if you're not using the gift God's given you, Jesus indicated in this parable, you're wicked, lazy, and worthless. Those aren't my words. Those are his. Those are his. You know, today, one of the hot questions that people like to ask when they're talking about the Bible or anything religious, I don't know why we ever started asking this right on the top of the list, but the question is it a salvation issue? You know, a better question on most of these things are we going to follow the Word of God, and what does the Bible say about it? God's going to be the judge. But is it a salvation issue? Well, if that impresses you, let me read these words again. Well done, thy good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Contrast that with throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Sounds to me like Jesus is saying using our gifts properly for the kingdom is a salvation issue. What does it sound like to you? May God in patience bless us all in this great work. If we can help you this morning in any way, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.
Let us rise up and build in the name of